Hello everyone, welcome back. Let's talk about AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. This is only a review based on gathered information. Please do not be swayed by advertisements, and choose and buy with open eyes, free from any promotions. AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D review. Stunning gaming performance meets top-tier productivity. AMD's 3D V-Cache technology has proven to be the killer tech that delivers dominating performance over Intel in gaming, and the second-gen revision propels the 16-core, 32-thread $699 Ryzen 9 9950X 3D to a whole new level of gaming performance, all while preserving the lion's share of performance in productivity applications.
Humans, what have you learned?
It also beats Intel's fastest competing gaming chip, the Core i9-14900K, by 26% on average in our test suite. In fact, on average, the 9950X 3D even ties the hands-down best CPU for gaming on the market, the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D. Naturally, performance will vary by title due to the vagaries of the 3D V-Cache tech, but the 9950X 3D is impressive in a wide range of workloads, and its higher 170W TDP also unlocks exceptional Intel-beating performance in many of our productivity benchmarks. AMD's game-boosting 3D V-Cache tech is now in its third generation, and this time around, AMD moved the vertically stacked 64 MB L3 cache chiplet from the top to the bottom of the compute chiplet to enable higher thermal headroom. As a result, the 9950X 3D has the same 170W/230W TDP threshold as the standard Ryzen 9 9950X model, instead of the 50W lower rating the company used with the previous Gen 7950X 3D model, which ultimately hampered performance. AMD's goal is to master both disciplines, gaming and productivity, with its dual chiplet X 3D processors, but that's a tricky technical challenge. To build on the success of the first-gen models, the company also refined its chipset drivers to deliver more accurate thread scheduling in some corner cases. This helps reduce the performance delta between its single and dual chiplet X 3D models. AMD also whipped in full overclocking support for the 9950X 3D, which we've tested, allowing you to eke out more performance in gaming and productivity work. For now, all eyes are on the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D, and from what we've seen, it's another grand slam against Intel. Team Blue still hasn't developed a counter to AMD's 3D V-Cache technology, effectively ceding the gaming crown to its rival in the desktop PC market. AMD's new optimizations serve widen the gap even further. Let's take a quick look at the new tech, then move on to the benchmarks. AMD also launched the lower-tier $599 Ryzen 9 9900X 3D, saying its new drivers help reduce the vast differences between the two last-generation models. We don't yet have the 9900X 3D for testing, but we're working to obtain a sample. As you can see, the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D is a tremendous chip in nearly every single category. For now, all eyes are on the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D, and from what we've seen, it's another grand slam against Intel. Team Blue still hasn't developed a counter to AMD's 3D V-Cache technology, effectively ceding the gaming crown to its rival in the desktop PC market. AMD's new optimizations serve widen the gap even further. Let's take a quick look at the new tech, then move on to the benchmarks. AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D pricing and specifications. As with the prior Gen 7000X 3D chips, the two new 9000X 3D chips use two compute dies, with one die featuring a 3D stacked V-Cache chiplet that increases L3 cache capacity to 128 megabytes. This keeps game data close to the execution cores, boosting performance in many types of titles, but not all. Meanwhile, the other standard chiplet can boost to higher frequencies to deliver more performance in both single and multi-threaded tasks. Overall, the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D is built on the same foundation as the Ryzen 9 9950X. It just has a single L3 SRAM chiplet placed under one of the compute dies. The Zen 5-powered Ryzen 9 9950X 3D comes armed with 16 cores, 32 threads, 144 megabytes of total cache, and a peak boost clock rate of 5.7 GHz. This chip has a 170W TDP, 50W higher than the prior gen model. That's because AMD's previous Gen 3D V-Cache chips employed a 3D stacked chiplet on top of the compute die, which trapped heat and constrained the operating temps/voltages. ultimately forcing AMD to lower the TDP. The new models now have the L3 SRAM die on the bottom of the chip, removing a barrier between the hotter compute die and the chip cooler. That unlocks higher thermal headroom. AMD extracts the additional headroom with the higher 17230W TDP, allowing higher clocks and longer sustained boost activity. The Ryzen 9 9900X 3D sports 12 cores, 24 threads, 140 MB of total cache, and a 5.5 GHz boost. This chip has the same 120/162W TDP as its predecessor and its non-X 3D counterpart, the Ryzen 9 9900X, so we expect significantly less performance than the 9950X 3D across the board. AMD hasn't sampled this chip, but says it has dramatically reduced the performance gulf between the two Ryzen 9X 3D models. We included the company's 9900X 3D benchmarks at the bottom of the following page. AMD's updated chipset drivers. The drivers have a suite of components that enable its dual chiplet processors to operate as close as possible to the single chiplet comparables, despite having only a single L3 cache die under one of the compute chiplets. AMD's first dual chiplet X 3D processors employed a new version of thread targeting that works in tandem with putting unneeded cores to sleep, thus forcing game code to run on the single chiplet that houses the performance-boosting L3 cache. However, this implementation made an irreversible change to the operating system that could hamper performance if the chip were later swapped out for a single CCD processor, with the only remedy being a complete reinstallation of the operating system. AMD has now fixed that issue with an updated provisioning packages service, the engine that manages core parking and thread targeting. After roughly 15 minutes of idle time, this driver now automatically detects when a new processor has been installed in the system and adjusts the provisioning accordingly, so there's no need for an operating system reinstall. Things are essentially plug-and-play now, as they should be. AMD also addressed a shortcoming with its 3D V-Cache performance optimizer, so it now works when virtualization-based security, VBS, is enabled on Windows 10. Despite multiple components working in concert to ensure that games run smoothly on the dual CCD models, some game titles remain problematic. To fix this, AMD revived its Application Compatibility Database, ACD, a technology that debuted with the first Threadripper CPUs. The ACD is a list-based feature that detects when certain games are launched. It then triggers a mechanism that reduces the number of threads, thus hiding them from the operating system and fully preventing the game code from running on the unoptimized chiplet. Internally, AMD has affectionately nicknamed this core lie because the feature lies with the operating system about the number of cores available. This mechanism assures optimal performance with several of the more stubborn titles, helping to once again reduce the difference between the single and dual chiplet X 3D models.
The same mistake.
AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D Gaming Benchmarks, the TLDR. Nearly every title in our 16-game test suite benefits tremendously from 3D V-Cache acceleration, but this isn't the case with all games in the wild. Some games simply don't benefit as much, or at all, from the 3D V-Cache. This can be due to either the game code or a GPU limitation. We have also included AMD's benchmarks with a very broad range of 40 titles at the end of this page to provide a more balanced view of the impact of 3D V-Cache in some titles that don't benefit. Here is the high-level view of gaming performance, using the geometric mean of our 16 gaming benchmarks at 1080p, which is then followed by our individual benchmarks further down the page. We're testing with an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 5090 Fe and NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4090 to reduce GPU-imposed bottlenecks as much as possible, and differences between test subjects will shrink with lesser cards or higher resolutions and fidelity. Once again, AMD's 3D V-Cache technology impresses us with stunningly good performance across our gaming benchmarks, with the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D matching AMD's claims of being within roughly 1% of the current fastest CPU for gaming, the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D. The 9800X 3D was 0.4% faster than the 9950X 3D across our full 1080p gaming suite, which is a tie. However, this removes much of the underlying nuance. The dual CCD Ryzen X 3D models are faster than the single CCD models in some titles, while roles are reversed in others. You can see which titles favor which below, but the big takeaway is that the 9950X 3D is wicked fast in gaming. AMD only claims a 20% lead over the 285K but the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D leads the Core Ultra 9 285K by a whopping 37% in our benchmarks, mirroring the delta we saw with the 9800X 3D launch. Intel's previous gen Core i9-14900K is actually the best contender against the AMD lineup in gaming, but the 9950X 3D is still an insurmountable 26% faster. Surprisingly, during our tests, we regularly saw the 9950X 3D's V-Cache CCD boost to 5.5 GHz, while the 9800X 3D was often in the 5.2 to 5.3 GHz range. Intel's troubled Arrow Lake continues to suffer. Intel originally said the Core Ultra chips would match the previous gen Core i9-14900K, but a chaotic launch found the chips severely trailing even the prior gen parts. Intel promised fixes to bring Arrow Lake up to the original claims of performance parity with its 14th gen chips, but our testing found that those fixes didn't help. In our testing, the latest Windows updates benefited the 14th gen chips more than Arrow Lake, worsening the situation. We retested again for this review. Even with the latest version of Windows and the RTX 5090, things haven't improved for our Arrow Lake test platform. The 9950X 3D is also a respectable 15% faster than the prior gen Ryzen 7 7800X 3D and 20% faster than the Ryzen 9 7950X 3D. AMD has finally brought full overclockability to its X 3D series, but we haven't done much fine-grained tuning. Instead, we tested with AMD's simple auto overclocking precision boost overdrive feature, marked with PBO in the chart, and it delivered less than a 1% gain in gaming. As such, we left that entry out of the individual game tests below. However, PBO was very impressive in the heavily threaded workloads in our productivity benchmarks. More targeted tuning might yield better results in gaming, but as always, your mileage will vary. Our gaming suite is very heavily skewed towards CPU-limited titles, and our selection is also very 3D V-Cache friendly. Again, not all games will benefit equally. The competition between AMD and Intel chips can vary based on the title, particularly with X3D models, and the GPU you use. A Plague Tale, Requiem benchmarks, AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. The Ryzen 9 98000X 3D starts out the gaming results with what will become a familiar trend throughout the rest of the results. It resides comfortably above the competing Intel processors.
What have you learned?
Baldur's Gate 3 benchmarks, AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. As you can see, the dual CCD 9950X 3D beats the single CCD 9800X 3D in this title, and the previous gen dual CCD Ryzen 9 7950X 3D also beats its single CCD comparable, the 7800X 3D. There are several more examples of this trend throughout the albums below. Some titles respond better to the dual CCD design, while others favor the single CCD design. Given that most games are locked to a single CCD regardless, we think this is largely the result of the 9950X 3D's higher effective clock rates on its cache-equipped CCD. Cyberpunk 2077 benchmarks, AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. Cyberpunk 2077 can be an incredibly GPU-heavy game with ray tracing, and we're opting for the more CPU-constrained Ultra, non-RT, settings without upscaling. And note that none of our CPU gaming tests have upscaling of any form enabled. F1 2024 benchmarks, AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. We test F1 24 with the Ultra preset, which does enable some RT effects. They're relatively lightweight compared to other games, and of course we're still hitting 200 plus FPS on most of the CPUs. Far Cry 6 benchmarks, AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. Far Cry 6 is an AMD-promoted game that responds incredibly well to 3D V-Cache. Hitman 3 benchmarks, AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. Hitman 3 leverages Intel's E-cores for certain game functions, but but it also likes Ryzen X 3D's voluminous L3 cache. We enabled ray tracing effects for this title to further tax the CPUs, but as you can see, the RTX 5090 still chews through this title easily if the CPU keeps it fed. Hogwarts Legacy Benchmarks. AMD Ryzen 9 50X 3D. Hogwarts Legacy is yet another game that slightly favors the Ryzen 9 50X 3D's dual CCD design. Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 Benchmarks. AMD Ryzen 9 50X 3D. Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 obviously benefits from L3 cache. The Ryzen X 3D chips are incredible in this title. We've added the newer version of this game to our benchmark suite, too, but we'll keep this one around as well due to its popularity. Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 Benchmarks. AMD Ryzen 9 50X 3D. We've also begun testing Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. This title relies heavily on data streaming and has a unique game engine, so it's time to start poking at it. As you can see, it inherits Flight Simulator 2020's love for 3D V-cache, perhaps even more so. Watch Dogs Legion Benchmarks. AMD Ryzen 9 50X 3D. Watch Dogs Legion closes out our testing with mundane scaling instead of the typical large deltas we see with the X3D chips. AMD's Ryzen 9 50X 3D gaming benchmarks. As mentioned, performance can vary based on the title. AMD shared its own benchmarks to highlight what you should expect in various titles, so this is useful information, especially given that our test suite is 3D V-cache friendly. As with all vendor-provided performance data, view it with the appropriate skepticism.
It was programmed to beat you.
AMD Ryzen 9 50X 3D Productivity Benchmarks, the TLDR. We boil down productivity application performance into two broad categories, single-threaded and multi-threaded. These slides show the geometric mean of performance in several of our most important tests in each of these categories, but be sure to look at the expanded results for more granular analysis. Selling a 16-core chip for $699 means it has to deliver the goods in productivity workloads, too. The Ryzen 9 50X 3D lives up to that billing, delivering a solid 20% gain over the prior gen Ryzen 7 50X 3D. Unlike the trends we saw with the previous gen models, the 9950X 3D matches the vanilla Ryzen 9 50X in our overall measure of performance in multi-threaded workloads. Notably, there are plenty of examples of the 9950X taking the lead in the heavily threaded workloads, but the difference in many of the real-world workloads is surprisingly slim. The $620 Core Ultra 9 285K is the 9950X 3D's real competitor in productivity workloads. It delivers far more performance in threaded workloads than the Core i9-14900K. Regardless, the 9950X 3D is 11% faster in threaded workloads than the 285K. However, our overall measurement is heavily influenced by performance in AVX 512 workloads. The 9950X 3D has an easy leg up due to its support for AVX 512, while the 285K can't leverage the performance boosting instructions. The results also have plenty of examples where the 285K takes the lead over the 9950X 3D in threaded workloads. The best CPU for gaming in 2025. AMD launches Ryzen 9 9950X 3D and 9900X 3D, claims 20% faster gaming performance than Intel's flagship Arrow Lake processors. Our simple PBO overclock yielded a 6% boost for the 9950X 3D with no real effort, and we also included those results. Remember, the Intel processors would also benefit from overclocking, but this would require far more manual intervention. What the Intel chips lack in sheer threaded horsepower, they make up for in single-threaded performance. In our cumulative single-thread performance measurement, the Core Ultra 9 285K is 7% faster than the 9950X 3D, and the 14900K is 3% faster. Rendering benchmarks. AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. Intel's Arrow Lake excels in many of the heavily threaded rendering workloads, like its huge leads in PO-Vray, C-Ray, and LuxMark C++. It also delivers leading performance in the single-threaded Cinebench R23 and 2024 benchmarks. The AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D also has its advantages, easily leading in Blender, Embry, and both Cinebench multi-core benchmarks, among others. Again, we see strong gains in some workloads from the PBO feature, and a surprisingly slim difference between the 9950X and 9950X 3D.
Humans, what have you learned?
Encoding benchmarks. AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. Most encoders tend to be either heavily threaded or almost exclusively single-threaded, and it takes an agile chip to master both disciplines. Handbrake, SVDHEVC, and SVT, AV1 serve as our threaded encoders, while LAME and FLAC are indicative of how the chips handle lightly threaded engines.
The same mistakes.
Adobe Photoshop, Premiere Pro, DaVinci Resolve, AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. The Puget Bench for Creators Suite is a wonderful tool for benchmarking multiple types of Adobe applications, not to mention DaVinci Resolve. We use the benchmark for Photoshop, Premiere Pro, and DaVinci workloads. Web browser, Office benchmarks, AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D.
Humans, what have you learned?
compilation, compression, AVX, chess engines, others, AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. This selection of tests runs the gamut from massively parallel molecular dynamics simulation code in NEMD to compression/decompression performance. Y-Cruncher computes Pi with the AVX instruction set, making for an exceedingly demanding benchmark. This benchmark was recently updated with specific tuning for AMD's AVX 512 implementation. The new code delivers a big boost to Ryzen. Intel's new chips make big strides in this benchmark over the prior generation, but they only support AVX 256 natively, so AMD gets an easy win. The Ryzen 9 chips are incredibly impressive in the BPP benchmark. Intel has historically performed well in compilation tasks, but the 9950X/3D clawed back the leadership spot in the LLVM benchmark, but by a slim margin. The 285K takes a strong lead in the NEMD simulation code benchmark, while the AMD processors excel at most chess engine benchmarks and the John the Ripper password cracker.
Was programmed to beat you.
Geekbench 6, Geekbench AI, AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. The Geekbench AI results in the slide deck above show performance with the workload running on the CPU cores via OpenVINO and ONNX. Only two CPUs in this group have inbuilt NPUs, the Core Ultra 9 285K and Ultra 7 265K, making them the only processors capable of running the workload on a dedicated NPU. Given that the NPU is focused on low-power inference tasks, the results are impressive relative to the performance when the workload executes on the CPU cores. AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D power consumption and efficiency. We are now measuring CPU power consumption metrics at the EPS 12V connector, so our new results are not comparable to the data in our prior reviews. We previously used software monitoring tools like IDA64 and HWinfo for our power measurements. These tools scrape power consumption measurements directly from the motherboard's sensor loop, thus removing VRM inefficiencies from the values and presumably showing us exactly how much power the processor consumes. However, motherboard OEMs can game these measurements, so we always did spot checks with various hardware-based measurement tools, Pownetics hardware or Passmark's inline PSU. And we've avoided using certain motherboards with unreliable power metrics in the past. We ultimately chose software monitoring because we can integrate it into our scripted tests, thus simplifying and speeding up the process, and it allows us to catch more granular workload data. Intercepting power at the EPS 12V connectors, the 8-pin connectors on the motherboard, is great for measuring power consumption. However, the main drawbacks are that it doesn't measure the true amount of power flowing into the processor due to VRM inefficiencies, typically in the range of 10 to 15% on high-end motherboards, and it wasn't easy to script the software trigger. We finally have hardware-based power monitoring with BenchLab equipment that can be integrated and scripted into our test suite. As a reminder, these values are measured before VRM inefficiencies are taken into account. The Ryzen 9 9950X 3D is a comparatively miserly chip, given the level of performance it delivers throughout our test suite. The chip peaked at 233W, but hovered in the low 200s during most workloads. In comparison, the Core i9-14900K is an egregious power guzzler, sucking down up to 383W during a Blender workload. And bear in mind this chip doesn't match the 9950X 3D in productivity workloads. The Core Ultra 9 285K is more miserly than the 14900K, but it peaks at 325W, showing it can also have a voracious appetite. In most workloads, the 285K draws as much or more power than the 9950X3D in its overclocked PBO configuration. As expected, we see a disproportionately large increase in power consumption for slim performance gains when we kick on the 9950X3D's PBO feature. Given the small gains in gaming, PBO certainly isn't worth it for gaming, but it is far more useful for those focused on productivity work. The watts per FPS chart quantifies power efficiency during an X265 handbrake workload. As you can see, the 9950X3D is near the top of the list with exceptional power efficiency, particularly given its 16-core design. The last two slides take a slightly different look at power consumption by plotting the cumulative energy required for an X265 handbrake and blender workload. We plot this task energy value in kilojoules on the left side of the chart, with performance charted on the x-axis. These workloads consist of a fixed amount of work, so we can plot the task energy against the performance during the job, bottom axis, thus generating a useful power chart. Faster compute performance and lower task energy are ideal. That means processors closest to the bottom right corner of the chart are the best. As you can see, the newest AMD chips gather in that area during the handbrake workload, but migrate to the upper right corner in the blender plot. Meanwhile, the 285K and other Arrow Lake chips greatly improve over their 14th gen predecessors. Final result. The $699 Ryzen 9 9950X3D sets a new bar for the company's potent lineup of gaming-optimized X3D processors, sharing the top spot with the Ryzen 9 9800X3D as the fastest gaming CPUs in the world. AMD's continued evolution of its groundbreaking 3D V-cache tech has dramatically reduced the trade-offs of lower productivity performance that used to be associated with its X3D chips, leaving little reason not to buy the chip if you prize both leading-edge gaming performance and real grunt power in productivity workloads. Intel doesn't have a chip that can deliver a comparable blend of performance in both gaming and productivity. For gamers interested in Intel chips, the 14th gen processors remain the fastest for gaming, but they can't compete with AMD's X3D processors, and their aging design isn't as powerful in productivity workloads as Intel's newer Arrow Lake Core Ultra 9 285K. Unfortunately for the Core Ultra 9 285K, while it maintains a lead over the 9950X3D in single-threaded work, it doesn't establish itself firmly enough in multi-threaded applications to give it a complete win over Ryzen 9 in productivity work, and it is obviously a painfully inadequate competitor in gaming. That leaves Intel without a meaningful competitor for the Ryzen 9 9950X3D. We conducted our gaming tests with an NVIDIA RTX 5090 and NVIDIA RTX 4090, so performance deltas will shrink with lesser cards and higher resolution and fidelity settings. It's a dead heat in 1080p gaming at the top of the chart, with the Ryzen 9 9950X3D matching the 9800X3D. More impressively, the 9950X3D dispatches Intel's chips easily, beating the 285K by 37% and the Core i9-14900K by 26%. Gaming is simply a no contest. The Ryzen 9 9950X3D is impressive in productivity work, too, matching the standard Ryzen 9 9950X in our overall measure of both single and multi-threaded workloads, an impressive accomplishment. It's also 11% faster than the 285K in threaded workloads, though Intel fires back by taking a 7% lead in single-threaded work. It isn't often that a generational increase in TDP and power consumption is considered a good thing, but that's exactly what we get with the Ryzen 9 9950X3D. The previous Gen 7950X3D had to step back 50W behind its standard counterpart due to its top-mounted L3 cache chiplet, but AMD's decision to move the chiplet to the bottom has drastically improved its ability to dissipate heat effectively. While we saw strong gains from this new technique with the single chiplet 9800X3D, it is perhaps most important with the dual CCD models. In the case of the 9950X3D, the extra 50W of headroom unleashes more horsepower for gaming and productivity work, making it the most powerful all-arounder that money can buy. AMD will also release the 9900X3D, but this chip doesn't look as promising. AMD's previous Gen 7900X3D suffered from a sizable performance gap with its more powerful counterpart, scuttling the value proposition. The company says it has reduced that disparity this time around. However, the price delta is still slim between the two chips, especially given what will be substantial differences between the chips in productivity workloads. Don't pull the trigger on that chip until you see third-party testing. Meanwhile, Arrow Lake remains a disappointment for us, and pretty much everyone else, too. Despite a string of BIOS, driver, management engine, and Windows updates, the Arrow Lake processors remain underwhelming on the multiple platforms we've tested. The Ryzen 9 9950X 3D scores another walk-in touchdown for AMD, easily earning its $699 price tag. Given the intense demand for the Ryzen 9 9800X 3D and the resulting rolling shortages, we expect it might be hard to get your hands on the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D at first, especially at MSRP. For those on the hunt for the highest-end performance money can buy, it will be worth the effort. If you can afford it, you won't find a mainstream desktop PC chip that offers a stronger blend of gaming and productivity performance.